Good afternoon, Excellencies, members of the committee, staff of the division, ladies and gentlemen. For two reasons, it's very difficult to speak after the video that we just watched. One is because the video is so powerful that I'm not sure that and pardon me for the other two speakers, but I'm not sure that we can match up. But secondly, that half of what I wanted to say about the role of civil society kind of came out in the video. Nevertheless, since the interpreters have my speech and will be translating from there, I'm going to have to go through it. So if I repeat what's been said, sorry about that. On the 9th of July 2005, Palestinian civil society and political organizations, about 200 in total, issued a call to the people of the world to implement boycotts, divestment and sanctions on Israel, in what is now famously known as the BDS call. 4 days later, on the 13th of July 2005, the call received its first global endorsement when the United Nations International Conference of Civil Society in Support of Middle East Peace, held in Paris, endorsed the call in its Civil Society Action Plan 2005. The call said, "We recognize that as an international network, our strength lies in our ability to work collectively in unified campaigns and actions. To that end, we urge international, national and regional social movements, organizations and coalitions to support the unified call of Palestinian civil society for a global campaign of boycotts, divestment and sanctions, to pressure Israel to end the occupation and fully comply with international law and all relevant United Nations resolutions." Since then, the BDS call has become the touchstone, the reference point, uniting symbol, and tactical and for some even strategic program for civil society globally. And so in talking about civil society initiatives for a comprehensive, just and lasting solution of the question of Palestine, we must necessarily focus on the global BDS movement. The call has three basic demands that it makes of Israel. Firstly, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. Number two, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And number three, respecting, protecting and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. All three demands are, of course, based on international law and on UN resolutions. Let me deviate slightly for just a moment to refer to the strategy of overcoming apartheid in South Africa in order to make a point later. In South Africa, we refer to what we call the 4 pillars of struggle that formed the basis of the struggle against apartheid. These 4 were, number 1, the armed struggle, number 2, the internal underground, number 3, international solidarity, and through it, international isolation of the South African state, and number 4, mass mobilization within the country. While we South Africans sometimes like to think that other people can learn from our experiences, good and bad experiences, we, together with the rest of civil society, acknowledge that our activism on Palestine must respond to what Palestinians request of us. So while we think that we had a good strategy for overcoming apartheid in South Africa, that doesn't necessarily mean that it would apply in the same kind of way elsewhere. Currently, that request from Palestinians is, in the main, certainly of civil society, to support and participate in the non-violent campaign of BDS. For South Africans, this was our 3rd pillar of the 4 that I mentioned. Let me note here that we acknowledge that in South Africa, the 3rd and 4th pillars, namely international solidarity and mass mobilization, were the most effective of the 4. From the Israeli perspective, of course, BDS is referred to as the main leg of a, quote, delegitimization campaign. Over the past almost 8 years, since 2005, the Palestinian BDS campaign has achieved more successes in various parts of the world than South Africa's campaign had in about 20 years or more. For South Africa, we had painstakingly begun with building a cultural and sports boycott, academic boycott, consumer boycott, followed by campaigns for disinvestment, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. These were long and hard campaigns, developed both within and without South Africa. And it took decades before we made any gains. By the time our liberation movements were unbanned in 1990, numerous Western countries in particular were still staunchly refusing to entertain the notion of sanctions. Like in the Palestinian case now, ours was a campaign of delegitimization and isolation of the apartheid state. Allow me to say at this point that for those who seek a just peace, there can be nothing wrong with delegitimizing or isolating an occupying colonial or apartheid state. Indeed, when that state was as strong, militarily, economically, and diplomatically, as apartheid South Africa was, or as Israel is, then such strategies are often the best strategies for foreign solidarity movements. And let me just add a note here at this point for Ambassador Ilan Baruch, who asked earlier on in his presentation, and to respond to his request. So I would say, and again, like you, Ilan, I don't have a mandate, you from the peace camp and me from global civil society or the solidarity movement, but nevertheless I'll assume symbolically that I have such a mandate as you did. And so I respond to your request by saying that what bars us from engaging normally with Israel is not you, the Israeli people, but the policies of your successive governments, their violations of international law and human rights. And let me add firstly that we in global society have no problem with engaging with Israelis who support justice. Justice for Palestinians and justice for themselves, for Israelis, who support international law and UN resolutions as they relate to Israel. And when Israel complies with all international laws and UN resolutions, we will be quite happy and ready to end the isolation of Israel. The BDS campaign focuses its attention on the Israeli state, institutions, and companies linked to settlement activity and to the state, as well as, for various reasons, on academic institutions. In the past 8 years, then, the Palestinian campaign has seen numerous victories. At the consumer level, for example, the Israeli company Agrexco was filing for liquidation in 2011 as a result of the campaign against it. Ahava closed its main London store and is being boycotted by retailers in UK, Norway, Japan, Canada, and South Africa. At the academic level, the most recent has been the decision by the Association for Asian American Studies to endorse the academic boycott. And 2 years ago, the University of Johannesburg in South Africa deciding not to enter into any institutional relations with Israeli institutions. At the cultural and sports level, with an increasing number of artists and writers refusing to perform in Israel and issuing statements or having performances in support of the Palestinian people and the BDS campaign. And some of you might recognize some of these names. For example, Bono, Snoop Dogg, Jean-Luc Godard, Elvis Costello, Gil Scott-Heron, Carlos Santana, Devendra Banhart, Faithless, The Pixies, Cassandra Wilson, Cat Power, Zakir Hussain, Roger Waters, Alice Walker, Naomi Klein, John Berger, Judith Butler, Etienne Baliba, Ken Loach, Arundhati Roy, Angela Davis, Sarah Skolman, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, to name some. At the commercial level, there have been some successes with companies like G4S. For example, the European Parliament decided not to renew a contract with G4S because of the campaign against it. And Veolia, and greater gains in, for example, South Africa, where a company producing dates bowed to pressure and severed its relationship with the Israeli company Hadiclane. Divestment decisions by churches and other civil society groups as well. For example, the Norwegian Finance Ministry deciding to exclude Israeli company Elbit from the investment portfolio of the government pension fund Global. Several European banks have also divested from Alstom, one of Veolia's partners in the Jerusalem Light Rail project. At governmental level, in the case of, for example, South Africa and some European countries, who are poised to pass legislation on the labeling of settlement products. In addition, there has also been an increase in attention given to the Jewish National Fund in some countries, such as the United States, South Africa, Scotland, and others. In South Africa, for example, a group of South African Jews have set up an organization called Stop the JNF to convince Jews in South Africa not to support the JNF because of the use of its funds to effect theft of Palestinian land, building of settlements, etc. One of the painful aspects of JNF activity for many South Africans is that the destroyed village of Lubia in the north of Israel, most of whose residents have been internally displaced, has been covered by the JNF, using South African funds with what is called the South Africa Forest, under the guise of an environmental project. Painful and a bit embarrassing for us. The JNF, along with other arms of the Israeli state, have, however, been working with determination in various parts of Africa. In South Africa, for example, it has an environmental project in a poor township called Mamelodi. There are also Israeli agricultural projects in South Africa and other parts of Africa. This makes tackling the JNF, of course, a little more difficult. Indeed, the penetration of the Israeli state in Africa and various other organs of Israeli society that support the state, particularly through various African governments, is disturbing and poses a serious challenge to civil society organizations. Not only is this a concern from the perspective of Palestinian solidarity, but in some cases it is also a concern for the sovereignty of these countries themselves and for the rights of their citizens. When private security services supported by a foreign state begin replacing policing, for example, this is a concerning trend that poses risks for the country concerned. And let me just add here that acknowledging everything that Ambassador Carr has said about the role of Africa in terms of supporting the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian struggle, I'm not sure that the role of Africa currently is as wonderful as we sometimes make it sound. Certainly, the manner in which various African countries collaborate with the Israeli state, overtly and covertly, is not something to be proud of. In my own country, for the past, since 2005, the date is not in any way related to the BDS call, but related to other political issues. Since 2005, on average, trade between Israel and South Africa has been increasing by about 15% in both directions. There are many African countries who have security and defense cooperation with the state of Israel. And so these are issues that we must more honestly look at. And civil society in all our countries on the continent have a particular role to look carefully at these issues and raise them and force their governments to defend those positions that have been taken. The role that global society Speaking about Palestinian solidarity on the continent of Africa, it must also be noted that while numerous countries in Africa have Palestinian solidarity organizations, and some have many, they have, however, failed thus far to develop a continent-wide solidarity network that could make all their activities more effective on the continent and the lobbying of their governments more effective. This remains, I think, an urgent task for these organizations. The role that global civil society can and should be playing then in attempting to work towards a just peace and towards the liberation of Palestinians and Israeli Jews is to broaden and deepen the BDS campaign. African civil society has been somewhat lacking in this regard, and it is about time that civil society groups on this continent responded vigorously to the BDS call. The call places on African and global civil society groups an immense task and responsibility to push forward the isolation of the Israeli state until it abides by international law and UN resolutions. Thank you.